Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt back again, Institute of Lutheran Theology, talking in this lecture about Socrates and Plato. Socrates, there's a wonderful bust of Socrates there, was born in 469 BC, died in 399. He wrote nothing. So we have a so-called Socratic problem. Who was the historical Socrates? Now, some of you might say, well, weren't there other guys that didn't write anything? Well, Jesus didn't, right? So who was the historical Jesus, right? Who was the historical Socrates? He shows up. Certainly Plato talks about him. Other sources, as you can see on the slide there, talk about him as well. And of course, Socrates is a figure in the Platonic dialogues, and so it's always the question, is this Plato putting words into Socrates' mouth, or is this the real Socrates and Plato recording it? We tend to think that the earlier dialogues of Plato show the more historical Socrates, and the later dialogues show the more Platonized Socrates. The main accents of Socrates' thought, well, he wasn't too impressed by the sophists, right? And I could tell the story of Socrates. I can't do it here, I just don't have the time. But let's put it this way. Socrates was not at all impressed with the sophists who claimed to know things, and of course didn't. And he wanted to show that most people who claimed to know something didn't really know it. And that he, of course, did at least know something, and that is that he didn't know it. And this is Socratic wisdom, see, at the bottom of the slide. In thinking through things, Socrates became, shall we say, disenchanted with the naturalist trajectory of the preceding Hellenistic philosophical tradition. He tired of the questions, what is everything made of, and it's just another natural thing. And he said, well, golly, the reality that I know most is the reality of being me, asking questions, and you answering questions. I live in a realm of value, right? You're trying to tell me that everything that I think and do and aspire for is but some complex configuration of water? Give me a break. Now, of course, we living today say, well, all of this stuff that we have is just, we're all made of atoms. Okay. Now, as you think about that, of course, Greek thinkers thought we were all made of atoms. Certainly Democritus thought that. But then, of course, the question of the freedom of the will arose, and Democritus very famously said, well, everything is in a void. The atoms fall through the void. See, this is the void. There's atoms falling, right? Atom, means something that cannot be divided. That which cannot be divided falls. But in the falling, sometimes there's a little swerve, and that's where freedom of the will comes from. Well, of course, it doesn't take somebody with a PhD in anything to say, well, this is kind of a lame account of freedom of the will. The problem here is we don't really have much better account. We can talk about us all being made up of atoms now. Quantum field theory. Things are much more complicated. But if all the fundamental laws of motion are at the micro level, it's difficult to see how there's any human freedom or how value is really real. Now, I can go into this stuff. This gets us into the notion of supervenient layers of properties, so-called downward causation. I mean, I can get into this literature. I'm not going to do it here. I can do it, but I'm not going to do it. But I will tell you that it's not altogether easy to have a non-reductive physicalist view of things, and claim that, well, just because we don't have laws that reduce all macro phenomena to micro phenomenon, we don't really have a problem. Non-reductive physicalism says that all that it is physical. Reality is comprised of the physical, but that there aren't any laws of reduction that nicely reduce that which doesn't seem physical, let's say psychological states, to physical states. Yet everything that is a psychological state is still realized in the physical. And of course we have certain fundamental laws at work in the physical. This is a very difficult question, and I reviewed a book not too long ago by John Searle, Neurobiology, I think, and Freedom. I mean, at least John Searle sees the question and the problem as well. I mean, it still is a problem. We have to understand this is still a problem. Well, anyway, Socrates wanted to put attention on the human realm and value. He sought a type of definitional knowledge. So in a dialogue by Plato, if someone were to ask, what is courage? If Socrates were to ask that of someone, let's say Lysis or somebody, what is courage? And the guy said, well, that's what Achilles does. That's not a very good definition. What we find in the Platonic dialogues and what we find with our good friend Socrates is that he wants to spurn extensional definitions in favor of intentional definitions. He wants to spurn, eschew, otherwise throw out extensional definitions of things in terms of intentional definitions. Things go full circle. Now in mathematics, we want to spurn intentional definitions and go only towards extensional definitions in terms of set theory, elements and sets. Now you're saying, well, what's an extensional definition? Well, an extensional definition of, I'm going to use an example, the Scandinavian countries. The extensional definition of the Scandinavian countries is a list of all of them. Oh, that's Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland. Not Finland, I guess. An intentional definition doesn't list everything that is that thing, but it gives the rule by which we sort those things. So an intentional definition of the Scandinavian country would give the necessary and sufficient conditions by which those four countries were picked out. Right? So I don't know what that would be. You could maybe cast it in terms of a certain longitude, latitude, perhaps geographical location. You could maybe have a certain, these are the Scandinavian countries, and give that, and then all those countries would fall within that, perhaps. So he wants to find Plato, the necessary and sufficient conditions for courage, the necessary and sufficient conditions for justice. This is by no means easy to do, and the fact that many of the reputed smart guys around Athens weren't able to do it probably is not a sign of their lack of intelligence. Very difficult to do. But this is what Socrates wanted. He did claim that the unexamined life is not worth living, or Plato put it in his mouth, and he taught that virtue was not teachable. Virtue is a little bit like being born with certain dispositions, and they can be cultivated in certain ways, but virtue cannot be taught. Now, when I use the word virtue here in Greek philosophy, I mean the power of a thing. Those those things, those attributes that the thing has. So I don't mean to say this in a moral sense. The virtue of a shipbuilder has to do with how he builds ships, right? That's the virtue, the shipbuilder's virtue. Anyway, these are main accents of Socrates' thought. Plato comes and studies with our good friend Socrates. Plato, as we've found out, was born in 429, died in 347. He was not a great follower of Heraclitus. He said, if that's the only world there is, well, I guess we don't know anything. So if the world really is a world of flux, there really is nothing definite and stable there to be known. The world which appears to our senses, Plato claims, is erroneous. On the other hand, there is a world that does not appear to our senses that we seem to grasp in thought. I can make statements about a sheep and how a sheep relates to a horse. But I don't mean by that, if I'm talking about how the kind sheep relates to kind horse, I'm not talking about a batch of microphysical actualizations and another batch of microphysical actualizations. The thing that I have knowledge of seems to be a thing of thought. It is not the thing in the world where everything's perpetual perishing, but the thing that I have knowledge of is a stable, unchangeable thing. The form of sheep and the form of horse. So there is according to Plato, a changeless world of forms that is real. And here, he's kind of going with Parmenides, right? Because Parmenides thought that being and thinking, those are all sort of falling together. We can know through thought that there is one thing, and that thing is a thing for thought. Thought thinks the thing that is, and it is in the thinking of the thing that is. Identity of being and thinking. For Plato, the changeless world of forms is real, and we can have knowledge of it. Now, when I first was introduced to this many years ago, it seemed kind of counterintuitive to me. But not very long after I started to think about it, then all of a sudden I was a Platonist. I couldn't get rid of being a Platonist for a long time because it seems like this is deeply true to me. Epistemology, of course, deals with the subject of knowing. What is it that we know? How do we know that we know? The question is, how is knowledge possible in a changing world? Plato's answer, knowledge is only possible if its objects are beyond the changing world. So there must be some other domain to be known than this changing world. And this is the domain of the forms. We're going to start Plato's metaphysics here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give us a short break and come back with the next lecture. So, thank you.